Welcome everyone to CGHE seminar stroke webinar number 272. And we have Georgiana Mihut with us today to talk about the role of the prestige factor as opposed to the human capital factor in the labour market. She's got a very interesting study which throws new light on an old problem. Before I introduce Georgiana properly, let me take you through the webinar protocols. Now, as you know, if you're a regular viewer, participant in our webinar series, the webinars are recorded and we post the outcome of the webinar on YouTube, usually within 48 hours or so. With our communications manager currently away, it's possible that won't be until early next week, but we'll see how that goes. We also post the chat, the public part of the chat discussion from the webinar as well. Now, during the webinar, please keep yourself muted unless you've been asked to speak in the Q&A section. Now, there's no need to have your video on either, but we'd like you to turn on both your audio and your video when you're asking a question or making a statement during the Q&A. We recommend using speaker view, the top right-hand corner there. That command gives you a look at who is talking at a given time during the webinar. Now, to ask a question, and we do encourage you to join the Q&A, or indeed to make your own statement, not as a question, please use the chat function. Initially, type out what you want to say in the chat. And on the basis of what's coming into the chat, I will select participants into the Q&A. I'll give people who are going to be asked to speak a warning by sending them a personal message in the Q&A. Or I may say on screen, the next person is going to be so-and-so. So if you've put forward something in the chat, keep following the webinar from then on. Don't wander off to get a cup of tea at that point. When you're invited in, most important to unmute yourself and turn on your video. And then when you've done that, say who you are and where you are from, and then launch into your contribution. Now, as I said, we do encourage you to participate in the webinar. And if you want to participate effectively, come in early with your points in the chat, because people come in the last 5 minutes or 10 minutes of the webinar often miss out. But anyone who puts forward their proposition or their question in the first 15 minutes or so of the Q&A, or better still towards the end of the speaker, will certainly be included if their points are relevant to the topic of the webinar. So if you try to sell something, don't worry, we won't put you on. But if you've got a pertinent point to make or a pertinent question to ask, please join it. This is a participative structure. We really encourage you to take part. Georgiana is with us from the Department of Education Studies at the University of Warwick. And previously she worked for Ireland's Economic and Social Research Institute, the American Council on Education, and the Boston College Center for International, I think it's going to be International Higher Education, yes. Georgiana is co-editor of a very recently published research handbook on university rankings, theory, methodology, influence and impact. She co-edited that with the famous Helen Hazelcorn, and I have a chapter in it, so let me recommend it to you as an excellent book. And unfortunately, Georgiana, we're not talking about research today, but we are talking about something equally important and interesting. I'll now hand over to you. Thanks.
Thank you, Simon, and CGHE for hosting me today. I very much look forward to having a conversation with all the participants. So please do engage with my topic. This is definitely something that is not resolved with my research, and current and future conversations will be very important. I'm also going to share my slides here, and I also want to say that I believe that for many of us today, our thinking and worries are not with this topic today. I imagine that many of us are stressed about what's happening in UK higher education, in the world, in Ukraine. So I am grateful for your participation here today, and I do look forward to engaging with you in today's conversation. So I'm going to present the topic of a paper I recently published, and it's also been the subject of my dissertation at Boston College. And the title is, Does University Prestige Lead to Discrimination in the Labor Market? Evidence from a labor market field experiment in 3 countries. As I said, this has been recently published by Studies in Higher Education, and you can see that our QR code where you can download a version of the article right now, or you can also access a free preprint of the article at the link below later on if you are interested. So what made me want to research this? The state of the academic literature on the topic of the relationship between university prestige and the labor market is full of empirical evidence that suggests that students who attend more prestigious universities have added monetary and non-monetary benefits in the labor market. There have been ample studies that have found some correlation between the prestige of the university you attended, in some studies is referred to as the quality of the institution you attended, and various labor market outcomes. By some estimates, graduates of more prestigious universities have up to 20% more earnings over the course of their lifetime than those who have went to less prestigious institutions. So some of the effect sizes of attending a more prestigious university document in the literature are quite significant, both practically and statistically. The current body of evidence also suggests that females benefit less from attending a prestigious university than males. So in one study, while the return for females attending universities was about 7 to 8%, compared to if you weren't attending a prestigious university, for males, it was 11 to 12%. So there's some evidence that, generally speaking, across financial returns, females see less benefit from attending a prestigious university. However, the state of the literature is primarily correlational. And these studies have not experimentally tested the relationship between university prestige and the labor market. This is changing right now. So there are a few studies out there that have attempted to use experimental designs to look at this relationship. But essentially, we are looking at correlational research when we're trying to answer questions about the relationship between university prestige and labor market in the current study. But the reason I was interested in this topic wasn't primarily because I saw a gap in the literature, but primarily because I was puzzled with the lack of critical engagement in the literature on the relationship between university prestige and labor market. If you were to replace university prestige on this slide with words like race, gender, disability, ethnicity, you would not uncritically engage with such substantive gaps being noted. However, the state of the literature is taken for granted that the relationship between university prestige and outcomes that come after graduating from university is warranted, or generally speaking, a reflection of merit. So I wanted to look at this question using a critical lens. And I wanted to find ways to show that we should not accept an automatic relationship between prestigious universities and added monetary and non-monetary returns. And I was trying through this research to find a framework that would allow me to convince other people that sometimes we should critically look at the relationship between university prestige and labor market outcomes. So what is my framework? Essentially, there are 3 main mechanisms that economists and other people looking at labor market stuff have used to explain the relationship between education and labor markets. The first one, and probably the most commonly used framework, is that of human capital. Essentially, the mechanism there is that by having added skills that education provides us with, we're able to be more productive in the labor market, and the labor market rewards those added skills that we have. Another mechanism is that of signaling, but sociologists also think about this as priming effects beyond signaling. I'm calling this here as the effect of the name. So whether or not you attended a certain type of institution, a certain level of education would communicate something to employers not necessarily because you know more, but because they assume productivity based on the information, the little information they have from you on something like a CV, for example. So this is generally referred to as a signal, which means that it's not actual productivity that leads to effects observed, but assumed productivity from employers. Another mechanism that generally explains the relationship between education and labor markets, but also what happens in labor markets more broadly, is social networking or social capital theory. And this theory and the mechanism would suggest that it's not necessarily through the skills we gain or the signaling elements of where we attended school that we see benefits from our education, but from all the other things that happen at universities or happen in educational entities, such as who we talk to, who we know, getting information about specific job openings in the hidden labor market, information about how to behave in interviews and the type of behaviors we need to embrace in order for people to believe that we are trustworthy. So all the soft stuff that can happen in educational institutions. So again, to summarize here, the relationship between universities more broadly, but also prestige in the context of my research and the labor market can be explained by skills, signaling, or networking. I'm also using this as a normative framework in my paper. So remember that the reason I got interested in this topic is because I find it curious that there was no critical engagement with the potential relationship between university prestige and labor market outcomes. So I'm using this theory as a theoretical framework of a normative nature in the following way. If university prestige matters above skills in the labor market, in sectors of the labor market where skills matter, we can, I would hope so, assume that that should not happen, that that is a discriminatory effect that we should fight against. So in that sense, I'm building a rather sophisticated test to show a minimum condition under which I believe we should not see a positive effect of university prestige in the labor market. So although human capital has its own limitations, for the purposes of this particular research, I'm thinking of it as an indication of appropriate use of university prestige in the labor market or university skills gained at the university in the labor market. So if employers respond to skills, I'm thinking that is an appropriate form of employers to engage with educational information. So my research questions are quite simple. Does university prestige matter in the hiring process? Does it matter in the hiring process above relevant skills? And do we see any differences between how much prestige matters between females and males? Now, in order to test this, I have used something that is called a field experiment of the labor market. This is a type of research approach in which the researcher submits fictitious applications to job openings and measures the callback rate. So on the resumes themselves that you submit as part of this application process, you would vary and control for the constructs of interest for your research. And then the data that you would use as the outcome variable in a study like this would be the callback rate, or the types of resumes, what types of resumes employers say they would want to hear more about, would call the fictitious applicant for an interview for. So that's what my data looks like in this case. The different conditions of the experiment and the outcome variables is the callback from employers to those particular resumes. I submitted 2,400 fictitious resumes for this study, 800 in each of the following countries: Australia, UK, and the United States. And I chose, for the purposes of this research, to focus on two skill-intensive sectors, which were ICT and accounting. Remember, the reason I've done this is because I was trying to find a way I can convince people that we can critically engage with the relationship of university prestige, but also because it is a bit easier to operationalize and measure skills and relevant skills in some of these more applied, more skill-intensive sectors of the labor market. It's also important to note at this stage that the fictitious applications belong to domestic students within each of the respective country. So then in Australia, I had domestic applicants that were attending universities within Australia, applying for the Australian labor market in the field of ICT and accounting. So going back to my framework here and looking at how I operationalized my design, human capital theory is operationalized in the context of the study by designing high match and low match resumes. And these are resumes that match a general job description for an entry-level accounting position or an entry-level ICT position. So the resumes would be either of high match with a generic requirements for entry-level applicant or of a low match with the same generic requirements. And that's how I measure human capital. Now, the effect of the name of the institution you attended, which you can think of as a signal or as a meritocratic priming or any other type of priming, was measured by randomly assigning the name of the university on my high and low match resumes. And I'm also assuming that because these are fictitious applications, they do not have any social network or any sort of social capital effect. So what I'm saying in my experiment is that absent of social capital, absent of networking components, which in reality would matter a lot, right? So who you would know, the type of information you would get potentially would matter in the labor market. So I'm taking that out of my experiment. Absent of this, what can we tell about whether skills or the name of the university you graduated from mattering in the employment process, in the hiring process? So a note on operationalizing university prestige, and I imagine this might be of relevance to this audience. For each country in which I submitted my resumes, I chose one high prestige university and one low prestige university. And these were randomly assigned to the resumes I submitted. So the high prestige university for each of the countries of my experiment were chosen as follows. Across the 3 countries, the institutions I've chosen were consistently ranked globally among the top 100 across the major university rankings. So these would be universities that would be consistently ranked in the top 100 globally. I also excluded the most prestigious institutions. So in the case of the UK, that meant that I excluded Oxford and Cambridge. In the case of the US, that meant I excluded a few institutions like Harvard, MIT, Stanford. Also, I cross-checked these lists with national available rankings or list for prestigious institutions. So in the US, these institutions the institution I've chosen was above 40 in the US World News and World Report. In Australia, my high prestigious university was in the group of 8. And in the UK, this was among the top 20 of the 2017 University League tables. And that's been consistent since. So it's a top 20 university in the UK. So the reason I've excluded the most prestigious universities from my research is, first, some of these institutions do not offer the applied majors I was looking for. So they would not always offer, for example, an accounting degree. But the second reason, and this is an argument that I would like to engage with you on, I'm making the case that insofar as university prestige only matters if you are at the very top of a very selective list, then that's not a very useful concept to have. So I'm thinking of university prestige as a slightly more democratic, inclusive concept that includes more than just the top 3 universities you can think of in a certain country. And this might have implications for the limitations for the study too. Now, it's actually trickier to come up with a low prestige university. So this is what I've done. And the reason it's difficult is because you don't want to conflate university prestige with quality, right? That wasn't what I was looking for. I wasn't interested in finding out if there's a difference between the perception of employers between a university like UW-Madison in the US and the University of Phoenix in the US. I was interested in finding out what having high prestige and low prestige does to applications, right? So these universities will still have to be of a certain quality, accredited, being able to provide education that we would want all universities to provide. So the way I've done this across countries was essentially to subtract all universities that appear in the US World News and World, essentially I excluded the most prestigious universities that I consistently ranked as prestigious for every country. So in the US, This did not include any of the universities that would be considered a national university. So there's a list in the US that compiles 300 and some universities that are called national universities. My low prestige university for the US was not the university included on this list. In the UK, I subtracted all universities listed in the best university in the UK ranking, which is 91 institutions. That is a good chunk of all institutions in the UK from the set of universities available in that country. And my low prestige university was from among the remaining institutions. Australia is very tricky because most of its universities are ranked globally. So in Australia, my low ranked university was never ranked higher than 400 globally. So the gap here would be potentially up to 350 points in a global ranking between my high ranked and my low ranked university for Australia. And I want to give you a sense of what these universities actually look like. Before I do that, I'm going to actually talk a bit about match here. So again, defining high match and low match was a process of looking at what job requirements in the specific sectors I've chosen look like. So I've actually done a content analysis of job openings in those fields and created sort of this ideal resume that would match entry-level applications for those fields. And essentially it was structured as this for accounting. The high match candidate for accounting had a relevant bachelor's degree. In this case, it was, this is for the US. It had a concentration in accounting. It wasn't a full bachelor in accounting, but it had a concentration in accounting. They had relevant coursework in this field, and they had 2 relevant internships for an accounting position. Now, the low match accounting resume had a bachelor's of arts in biology with a minor in business, had some stats courses, some math courses, and 1 course in accounting, but they didn't have any relevant internships. And of course, the major was not on point. They had some math tutoring experience, so the thinking behind the low match resumes was to have some level of transferable skills that could be potentially interpreted by employers as a leap, a feasible leap, in part because one of the goals of a fictitious application is not for it to be always rejected, right? So you want for it to be at least looked at a bit in the application process. And this is how my resumes actually look like. I don't expect you to see this, but they would be very generic resumes that could come from an actual person. Of course, I had to develop email addresses, phone numbers, specific locations, trainings, those sorts of things. So before I actually discuss the findings of this experiment, I do want to talk a bit about the limitations. And this is because I think it's particularly important to be mindful of what we can take from the study and what we can't take from the study. The first thing I want to say is that the findings of this study cannot be generalized beyond the first stage of the recruitment process. This is important because university prestige may matter at other stages. It may matter later in the process when you have an interview. It may matter in terms of getting an offer or not. It may matter in terms of the salary you receive after you're hired, promotion, or any other aspect connected to the labor market. So this is not an inference about university prestige in relation to every aspect of the labor market. I also need to say that the results cannot be generalized to other sectors of the labor market. So I've conducted a study with a focus on IT and accounting. These are skill-intensive sectors of the labor market. I would imagine that you would see similar results in other skill-intensive sectors of the labor market, but I would not automatically assume that this would happen across all sectors of the labor market. Although the more I'm thinking about it, I do think that most sectors of the labor market would have tangible skills that would potentially be of higher relevance than university prestige, but that's something that remains to be tested. I also have to say that the results may not apply to the effect of the most prestigious institutions. Maybe if my high prestige university in the UK would have been Oxford, maybe the results would have been different. So it's not necessarily a function of the high elite among the high elites of prestigious universities. One of the other variables that may matter in this relationship is not necessarily on whether or not you get a callback, but it's who gives you a callback. So there are all sorts of elements around the desirability of the company, the selectivity of the company, when it comes to hiring patterns. So this may be relevant here too. So maybe the results may look differently if we looked at select companies, for example, which I have not. And it is not a double-blind experiment. I tried to make my design quite transparent and explicit. I've done some piloting. I've interviewed recruiters to receive feedback on different aspects of the resumes, but it remains not to be a double-blind experimental design. So my models for the analysis were as follows. I was trying to, again, test the effect of the match of the application, that is the human capital condition, the prestige condition, the interaction between prestige and match on callbacks. Those were the main variables connected to the framework I had for this study. I was also interested in the effect of sex, sector of the labor market, and whether we see differences between countries in the effects observed. So this is a setup of the analysis. And I should tell you at this point that across all conditions and all countries, 11.5% of my applications received a callback. So that was 276 out of 2,400. So my results suggest that the match of the application is very important for callbacks. Applications in the high match condition were 79% more likely to receive a callback than applications in the low match condition. So human capital was a statistically significant, and I would say practically significant, predictor of callbacks. What I did not see in my experiment was any prestige effect. So the name of the university attended, the interaction between the name of the university attended and the match of the application did not predict callback. So I did not see any signaling effect in my applications. I also did not find any statistically significant effect between female and male fictitious applicants. Did not find any differences between sectors of the labor market. There were some differences between countries, but they were not due to the main experimental conditions. They were due to the difference in callback rates between countries. And I'm going to show some descriptive findings that will make it clear for you to understand this. So again, I found no prestige-based and no sex-based discrimination in this study. So to contextualize these findings descriptively, what you see here is the difference in callback rates by match and by prestige. So what you see that for my high match applications, there was a slightly higher callback rate for high prestige than low prestige, but virtually I had the same callback for both the low prestige and the high prestige institutions. For the low match applications, the ones that had some transferable skills but did not fully match the job description, I had descriptively slightly higher callback rates, but that was not a statistically significant difference. Similarly, for both high match and low match applications, I have not seen any sex-based differences in callbacks. In fact, for my high match applications, females and males were equally likely to get a callback. So again, 19.1% of my applications from males and females in the high match condition received a callback. There was a slight difference in the low match condition by sex. So females were slightly more likely to receive a callback if among the low match applications, but that was again not statistically significant. Similarly, you see some variations by fields here, but not too much. My IT applications received a slightly higher callback rate than my accounting applications. These are very high callback rates for a field experiment of the labor market. And the reverse was true for my low match condition. But again, the difference was not statistically significant. This also varied by country, so it wasn't a function of the quality of the resumes. I think it might be a function of the demand for certain positions in different countries and the hiring cycle when I send my applications. And this is how the applications look like between countries. And this is what explains the fact that the country effect for the UK was statistically significant. I just had many more callbacks in the UK than I had in Australia and the United States, both for my low match and my high match applications. So going back to the framework of this paper and the thinking behind designing this experiment. Remember, this was designed as a litmus test that would potentially convince people that would unquestionably look at the relationship between university prestige and the labor market as something that perhaps reflects merit or selectivity, as something where people would pause and say, hey, if you see prestige effects above skills in sectors where skills matters, this is problematic. So this is a high test to pass that was meant to test problematic forms of discrimination, the most overt forms of discrimination you can imagine. So in this most overt form of discrimination test, I have not seen that. This doesn't mean that prestige doesn't matter in other forms, and I'll talk briefly about that later. But going back to the framework here, what I did find was that human capital, as measured through the high and low match resumes, was associated with callbacks, predicted callbacks, and almost there were people from fictitious applicants in the high match condition were almost 80% more likely to receive a callback, which is something you would expect. This is not a surprising finding in itself. It is a strong, sustained finding that suggests that mechanisms we have around teaching and learning and human capital development are predictive of labor market outcomes. However, I did not find any effect of the name of the university mattering for these callbacks. And this is not just for the difference between matches. For the same match, so having high match applications coming from more prestigious university or from a less prestigious university, that made absolutely no difference in my experiment. And again, I'm making this claim while saying that I've had no networking effects in my experiment. So after me telling you all of that, I'm going to now tell you why prestige may still matter in the labor market. And these are some documented forms through which it matters. We know that practices such as reverse recruitment happens at elite institutions. This is a practice that's been documented by Rivera, in which she cogently describes situations where elite elite companies go specifically to a campus of elite institutions and only hire from those campuses for select positions. It's something that happens in law. It's something that happens among elite consulting firms. And since I'm coming to the US, to the UK, since I came to the UK, I've realized this also happens in the UK through other forms. It's not just a US specific practice. Prestige may matter at later stages in the recruitment process. It's not something I've covered here. If I were to have included top institutions, maybe the results would have been different. If you're interested in the effects of top institutions in the labor market, there are two studies that do this. Gaddis and Jackson do look at this. Jackson didn't have enough data to make inferential claims based on the experiment conducted, but there were descriptive differences based on university prestige. It may be the case that prestige matters in less skill-intensive sectors of the labor market. And it may matter for other types of sectors, say public servant positions in the UK. That's been an example that's been generally given to me when I've talked about this topic, but maybe also some specific leadership positions. The other thing I'm thinking more about these days is how the importance of university prestige may be a function of supply and demand in relation to number of applicants to available positions. We do know that for the academic labor market, for example, university prestige matters quite a bit. And that is in part a function of supply and demand. But I'm also thinking what automation in different fields may do to the effect of university prestige. I wouldn't be surprised if we would see more prestige-based signaling mattering in more sectors as automation becomes more prevalent, even in high-skill sectors. So what does this mean? My conclusion, based on my data, given the constraints and the buildup of my experiment, allows me to say the following, I believe. Perhaps, absent of being at the top of the university rankings, university prestige does not have practical implications for the labor market in skill-intensive sectors. I also think that perhaps students should prioritize teaching quality above institutional prestige when choosing a university. This is particularly applicable to systems where there is a high price differential between attending a more or less prestigious institution. I do think that that prestige should not matter as much for student choice. And I think the big message for my study is essentially that governments, higher education institutions should focus on promoting the teaching mission of universities, consolidating skill building among students, and the promotion of teaching across all institutions, regardless of prestige. And hopefully, less prestigious universities should be proud of being able to provide good quality education to students that they would be able to use later on in their lives. Before I conclude, I do want to put a plug for an event that Ellen Hazelcorn will be a part of later this spring in the CGHE seminar series. This will be discussing the handbook that Simon graciously mentioned in the beginning of my talk, and hopefully I'll see some of you there. And thank you. I look forward to having an engaging conversation.
And thank you, Georgiana. Well, it certainly opened a really interesting discussion, I think. I'm going to start the process. We've got a couple of people in the chat as well coming through. Now, you took out the social capital factor. You took out the networking factor, and I wonder if that doesn't take out a lot of the prestige factor with it. I mean, the argument about prestige partly rests on a claim about the impact that that networking functions, social capital functions have, and if you've eliminated that by using fake applications, that might have an effect on your data. I mean, arguably, of course, the first cull is not particularly discriminating, but presumably, if there's no possibility of any kind of prior judgment about the applications of any sort, that does push the data towards your outcome.
Yeah, there's not much to say about that. I think you're spot on with this analysis. It's very possible that in reality, the mechanism through which university prestige may matter is not about productivity or signaling, but about networking. Exactly. Yeah. So this is a feasible conclusion from my study for sure.
I mean, I always thought with the signaling argument, it was really kind of proxy for human capital anyway, and it's not that far away. It's like an alternative. You're using the same data and the same kind of reasoning, using an alternative interpretation, whereas the social capital argument is a different kind of argument. It says that the different causal factors are at work, and use different empirical methods to track them. The other thing I wanted to say was, I suppose, more kind of lighthearted point but you've maybe answered it already by taking, the big prestige institutions out of the equation. But, if everyone was convinced that you were right, and really prestige didn't matter, would we face a massive exodus from Oxford? Would we no longer be dealing with the hundreds of applications we're currently trying to process? I mean, would human behavior change? Or are there other things at work than the potential income effects?
Yeah, so when I defended my PhD at Boston College, it was at the time when the scandal around bribes for admissions was happening in the US. And one of the questions I received was, what would you tell the parents of these students who have bribed admission councils and soccer coaches to facilitate admissions to elite institutions? And my answer to that was, I don't think there's anything I can tell these parents to convince them they should engage in this behavior. And that is because the reasoning they engage in this behavior is not about getting potential benefits in the labor market for their children. It's about status, right? Yeah. So this is not something that you would change by bringing forward an argument about discrimination in the labor market, for sure. Yeah. I don't think.
And you could make an argument that signaling is about, arguably can be understood in terms of status as well as understood in terms of, a proxy for human capital. The signaling role of, the status has nothing but signals, really. That's all it is. Well, look, I better start on our many participants. Catherine Abel came in first, and I persuaded her, I think, to make a contribution. Catherine, are you there? Good.
Yeah, you did have to persuade me, Simon, because Georgina, absolutely fascinated by this. But for me, it seems to have more relevance from the sector that I work in, because I'm actually based in Spain, and I help Spanish students who want to go and study in other countries. And obviously students that are not in, in the destination country, one of the things that they focus on to, to assess which universities they're interested in applying to is rankings and prestige and what they've heard of. And I'm just absolutely flabbergasted by this, because it just really, really calls to me. So I've got a few points that I want to say. You don't have to answer all of them, but these are the things that have been going through my head while I've been listening to you. First of all, congratulations on your research. I can't imagine how much time it must have taken you to create all those CVs and all those email addresses and everything. I think it was really interesting how you set out your research methodology, which was really interesting. Secondly, I think it's excellent as well the limitations that you've mentioned, which obviously would significantly have, the results may have been significantly different if you'd have done things in a slightly different way. And just picking up on that point that Simon mentioned about the social networking, because I deal with students that actually move country, they don't have that social networking. So if a student's perception is that if they go to, a high-ranking university over a lesser-known university, that your research actually fits them perfectly, because they don't have that social networking that somebody from the home country would possibly have. The other thing I wanted to mention is that I'm familiar with a report in the UK called the High Flyers report, which you're probably aware of. And that focuses on, I think it's the top 100 companies in the UK where they get the best graduates from. And when you glanced at that, you could think that, oh, well, that these top 20 universities then are the best in the UK. But what's not really obvious is that they actually only analyse the top 30 universities in the country. So what that means is they're only analysing the employability of the top 30 universities, where it might be that a university that's actually much more down in the rankings or that has a lower prestige could actually have just as good an employability. And then the final point I wanted to make, yesterday I got a message from a student that wants to study in the UK, and this morning a student that wants to study in Germany. And they both asked me, just to show how important this is, well, what are my job prospects when I leave that particular university? And I spend so much time saying to the students, if you can make the most of the opportunities that you have at university and improve your skills and your knowledge and your CV, etc., does it really matter which university you go to? Because it's going to be you that's going to be the determining factor as to whether you have just job prospects, not the university that you go to. How much notice they take of me is another matter, but half of my life is spent fighting this perception that going to a prestigious university is going to open doors. So congratulations on an excellent piece of research.
Yeah, thank you for those comments. There's not much to say about any of the stuff you've said. I think you're right with your analysis. I do think though, and I think we have more and more evidence that, for example, field of study matters much more for labor market outcomes than the university you attend, even across prestige. So that's becoming more clear, even among people who don't engage critically with university prestige effects. We see bigger gaps in earnings by field than by prestige at the moment. So that's something that if people are particularly concerned about labor market outcomes more broadly, you can mention to them. Yeah, doing important work, keep doing it.
Thank you both. Our next speaker is, or next in the Q&A is Golo Hinseki. Golo. Here he is.
Thank you so much. Very interesting talk. I just had two questions. First, around the role of AI in the recruitment process, especially at entry level, the roles that you're looking at. Do you have any idea how important AI was in this recruitment process? And I mean, I don't know how these algorithms are trained, but I feel like I don't know the underlying data that is used to train them. But if a university name doesn't matter in the training of this algorithms, I mean, then they might as well not pick up on it. The other thing I was surprised by the accountancy, and maybe that's just simply my misunderstanding, but I feel like accounting is in some parts in the UK, for example, regulated, at least in some jobs are regulated, where you need an accounting qualification to do provide certain services. Does that matter for your interpretation, for the interpretation of your results? Or did that matter at this point where you looked for the jobs that you looked at?
Yeah, so on the first point, there are a couple of other field experiments of the labor market that did find an effect of prestige. What was different across those studies was they either focused on the very elite institutions, or they did not focus on match between the field and the CV as much as I did. But to be honest, and they found the prestige effect. So I don't think if algorithms are making the initial stage recruitment decision, they would be trained not to look at prestige, because other studies have found some significance there across other variables. My general point is that it doesn't really matter if it's an algorithm or a person making this decision, insofar as there are biases involved, and we do know that there are quite a few biases involved with AI making decisions at the moment. So I think it would be worthwhile testing that. It's possible they got around that issue in the AI selection process. What I can tell you is for my experiment, I can't know if the initial screening was conducted by AI, but I did receive quite a few personalized emails from HR reps at different companies. So I applied for companies that were different sizes in different countries. I don't think most of these companies would have had the resources to use an AI software for the analysis. They were sometimes very small companies. And yeah, I did get quite a bit of human engagement in this experiment. It's something that I don't talk about in my presentation, but this has been emotionally very draining for me to conduct the study, because there were these people who were sending me tailored emails saying they want to meet the person behind the resume, and I didn't engage with them. There's a big ethical cost with this type of studies. Yeah, and I felt it personally, but I also think it's worth thinking about when and how we can justify making these type of experimental approaches. Now, in relation to your second question, that's a very good point. The positions I applied for allowed for, I guess they weren't requiring, essentially my high match resumes had all the requirements they would have had to have, but I still got some callbacks for my low match resume. So I don't know if all the positions I applied for would have required for certified accounting positions, or they were a bit broader than that. I can look exactly at my search terms, and I think some would have, and some wouldn't have not required the level of certification by accounting professions. But you're right, regulated professions will likely be a bit different.
Thank you both. I'd like to bring in Maria Leguia Barbosa at this stage, but I'm not sure whether, there she is. Good.
Yes.
Far away, Maria.
Yes, from Rio de Janeiro. Congratulations for your research. I loved to see it. And I would like just to make a question, because it would be important for our research here in Brazil. It is that maybe you are examining for certain areas the difference between credentials and merit. Of course, human capital cannot be translated into merit, but some way it seems that at least in these areas you examined, the idea of merit could be present in the selection process you engaged in. So I would like to listen about that. Thank you very much. It was fascinating to read and to listen to your conference.
Yeah, so reflections on merit are very complicated. In my study, I think of skill match as a reflection of merit, rather than attending a more prestigious university being a reflection of merit. And I engage quite critical with discourses around meritocracy in my own work. I'm changing my mind a bit about that, because I do think that we're seeing more justifications for nepotism and corruption coming from some of the critiques we have against meritocracy, which I'm not comfortable with. But I do think it's worth thinking more broadly about what we mean by merit and the type of consequences that discourses around merit have on individuals. Micah and Saldell is doing a great job showing some of the problematic ways in which merit has been used and the damaging effect it has on individuals that by whatever metric of merit we use, don't achieve as much as they could achieve because it's their own responsibility to do that. So I'm more concerned with systems and policies and what we can do to increase access, equality, make sure that standards are met across the board. So that's sort of where my philosophical position comes from in engaging with this topic.
Yeah, I think a lot of us are looking at the Michael Sandel work now, and that's, it's been out for a couple of years, but it's beginning to have quite an impact on, the broader discussion, the broader perception, and certainly the critique of merit is becoming more widespread. I think it's going to change thinking a bit. So he's done very well. Next in our call list is Monica Jaswal Oliver, who's been waiting patiently on screen there. Monica, your moment has come.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you, Georgiana. This is amazing to listen to you and also read your publications. My question, because my research is based on female international students in higher education and labor markets. So that's where I'm coming from. So my question is about, you had male and female. Did you distinguish how many were international students in that? And also, how does that impact the funding, both from students and also in institutional at institutional level, which is, based on scholarships and funding from that aspect. Thank you, Simon. And thank you, Georgiana.
Yes, so all of the applicants, all of the fictitious applicants in my my experiment were domestic students. None of them were international students. So I wouldn't be able to see if say anything about whether being an international student at an elite university or less prestigious university would matter in the labor market. That's not something I've looked at. There's some interesting research on China at the moment with returnee Chinese students that are looking at the effect of university prestige, but I don't think they've included gender in their variable. It's interesting that AI was brought up. Some of these experimental studies are actually conducting using AI at the moment. So you have bots sending fictitious applications. So the size of the effects, the size of the number of applications being submitted out there can be quite high in some of these studies. But I don't look at that in my own study. I also, the issue of funding wasn't something I looked at specifically here, but I mean, on a policy level, I would make the case that funding should maybe prioritize teaching a bit more than research at the moment. So that would be something that, because I'm finding a strong relevance of skills among applicants, I do think that tells us something about the importance of the teaching mission of the universities. And I think more resources at the institutional level and policy level should be devoted to teaching activity and teaching quality.
And Xiaoxi Li is our next question. Xiaoxi, come in.
Okay, thank you, Simon, and thank you, Dr. Georgiana. And I think you have partly addressed the question because you just said the pseudonyms in the fictitious CVs are all from domestic students. But I realize that for some Chinese Americans or some articles that when they are searching for jobs, they usually use the English names rather than their original Chinese names. So I'm just wondering if you were able to explore any racial discrimination through the names. Or you see the pseudonyms used in your study as a control variable. Thank you.
Yeah, so this is definitely another limitation of my study. I did not include any race variables in my study. The history of the field experiment of the labor market is actually based on studies that look at racial discrimination in the labor markets. The first few studies that have used this method have looked at the difference of having an ethnically sounding name or English sounding name in the labor market. And they have been very powerful because they have shown us that employers favored English sounding names above ethnic sounding names. So there are other bodies of work that would be able to answer your question, but I do not look at this variable in my study.
Okay, thank you.
So I wanted to raise with you, additionally, Georgiana, I mean, you said that people should pay attention to teaching quality. How? I mean, what data would I wouldn't rely on student satisfaction data as a way of telling us about teaching quality, for example.
No, I would not rely on
you know,
that.
we don't have a sort of comparative measure across disciplines and across institutions of teaching quality. So and that's always been the idea of the market, you know, that's what people will do. But the proxies that have been used to, you know, assess quality have been things like earnings and student satisfaction surveys, which are hopeless. You know, they're nowhere near the teaching process.
Yeah, I mean, my argument is not that we need to measure teaching quality, but that we should invest in teaching. So I think that's an easier thing to argue for and develop. Yeah.
So we had a contribution in the chat from Sizwe Makwazi, and I think the question was, where is your research published? You know, where is your findings today? Where can people access them?
Yes, I'm going to post the links in the chat right now. The article is behind the paywall. I have 50 free copies that people can access if they're interested in, but I also have a free preprint available. So I generally direct people to the free preprint. And it's...
Now, we've got Sharon Ulsh, A-U-L-T-S-C-H, Ulsh. Sharon, would you like to come in, please?
Yes, hi, thank you. Thank you, Georgiana. I just want to expand the idea about focusing on the teaching mission of universities and what the implications might be with respect to tenure and promotion, and the current emphasis much more on faculty research as a way, you know, sort of incentivizing tenure and promotion rather than necessarily pedagogy expertise. And I wonder what your comment might be to that.
So, yeah, I do research, and I think research is very important, but I also think teaching is very important. And I do think there should be more developed teaching tracks that are stable, continuous, and allow people to progress in their teaching path. I think the US is, the UK is an interesting example here. My understanding is that the UK has tenure track positions for teaching only staff, even at the lead institution. So you can have a teaching role or a teaching and research role. And I do think it's important to avoid having most of the precarity in some fields, at least on the teaching track, and having more support for people engaging in good quality teaching. I would also make the case that doing good research may impact on teaching quality too, especially for some fields, but I think the evidence on that is a bit mixed. So I don't think that's always the case.
Georgiana, I'm afraid we're going to have to wrap up slightly earlier than usual today, and that is on time, because I've unfortunately got a couple of meetings that I have to attend almost immediately. Normally we let it run till about 5 past. But at this stage, I'll have to call it quits. I mean, let me say that I think what you've done is really important. I think, you know, for getting us all to think more about what we learn, what students learn, you know, the formative effects of education, rather than focusing on it as a prestige competition and a signaling process in relation to status or human capital, is really useful, really, you know, salutary, and, you know, and asserting that all institutions are capable of producing, you know, good quality education and well-formed, self-formed students is also really important and encouraging and quite democratizing. So I think you've done us all a great service, and it'd be good to get that research into, you know, popular forms as well as into its substantial long paper form. And we'd be happy to publish a working paper and a short paper and give that a push on through the CGHE website and through our social media promotion process. So stay in touch, and I'll be in touch with you directly after this webinar. We really welcome, the opportunity to support your research and push it out there. Thanks for participating, everyone. There's, education and the labour market, not a simple problem, but a really important discussion. We'll continue to have that discussion in lots of ways and use research-based approaches to try and unravel it. Our next discussion was going to be on Tuesday, but our webinar presenter on Tuesday has unfortunately had a death in the family and just had to withdraw. I've been scrambling around to put a replacement webinar in place. And to cut a very long story short, what we're going to do is not a Tuesday webinar, but a Wednesday webinar when our speakers are available, who'll talk about the Augur report and the response of government in the UK to the Augur report, the new loan structure, the new decisions on management of student entry, the new reworking of the relationship between higher education and further education, quite a big policy shift in the UK announced today. And our panel will look at that next Wednesday with Claire Callender at the forefront of that panel, who's the expert on student loans and the effects of student loans on graduate decision making. So we look forward to seeing you not on Tuesday, on Wednesday. It's an important discussion on a big, hot political topic in the UK, and what happens in the UK does tend to get noticed elsewhere. So do come on Wednesday. On the next day, on Thursday, we're looking again at Chinese higher education and the idea of Tianxia as a new way of thinking about worldwide relationships in higher education. That'll be presented by Lily Yang and Xin Shu and myself. So look forward to seeing you Wednesday. Look forward to seeing you Thursday and in subsequent webinars. And once again, Georgiana, congratulations on a fine paper, and we look forward to seeing you again. Thanks very much.